somos poquitos para esta tercera parte, ¿verdad? Que esta tercera parte es un poquito más técnica, pero también es importante, ¿verdad? Para completar el proceso de publicación, ¿verdad? Porque tras que lo escribe, pues tienes que saber cómo se meterlo, cómo enamorar a los editores para que el journal lo logre publicar. Así que por eso que lo estamos dando, ¿verdad? Espero que sea del agrado a ustedes. Para repasar, adiós, era en inglés, Dios mío, se me olvidó. Era en inglés, ¿verdad? Ok. I'm, I'm sorry, I started in Spanish. Anyway, let me go back so you can edit this. Okay, here we're going to talk. Empiezo. See? Okay. Here we're going to talk about the third part of the three-part series of writing for biomedical publication. We're going to deal with submission, revision, review, and publication. To give an overview of the first two parts, in the first part we talk about more of the understanding of the publishing process, what and when to publish, importance of commitment, deciding on a target journal, and co-authorship issues. And we started talking about the preparation of a manuscript with the title, keywords, and abstract. For the second part, we sort of really dived in more intensely with the introduction, materials and methods, results, and discussion. And today, we're going to finish out with the manuscript, talking about acknowledgments, literature cited, and then go into the submission process. So starting off with acknowledgments, everybody thinks it's really easy, but it really requires a technique. So we're here to offer a little information on that. When you decide who are you going to acknowledge, please be reminded that you want to recognize those people who contributed in a significant way or meaningful way, but not sufficient to become a co-author. So these are the people who provided technical, statistical, secretarial support, but they were not involved in the experimental design or in the manuscript preparation. So to make sure that these are the people that don't have a conceptual appreciation for the message, they don't know the whole picture. So they can't take public responsibility for the manuscript. As you may recall, we talked about the authorships in part one, that all authors are responsible for the public message. So if this person just helped a little bit, they can't be responsible for that. So here we recognize those people who enabled the authors to perform the experiments, those people who went out there and recruited your study subject, because that's something that takes a lot of time, and you want to tell them, want to give them thanks in some way. Those who really looked at your work, critiqued it, and helped you along the way of forming the good message you want to convey, but they weren't really involved in the design or data. And then even some people who just provided the space and the area so you can do the research. Some campuses are very limited in space, and a person who shares their lab or shares their equipment should be recognized in some way. So when you acknowledge financial support, you really have to look at them. Most really want them. You want to convey that the funding was from whoever, NIH, USDA, if it was a national organization or foundations. If it's a specific award, you have to write the identifier so the person can look it up and make sure that that's really stated there. And then if an author, maybe a young author, has some startup funds or the institution gave them some money so they can start up something, you have to recognize that. And then, when you're doing this, when you finish your publications, it might be good to send these funding agencies a copy of publications. For NIH, it's obliged. But then for the other ones, it would be nice. It won't hurt. It will just say, as a way of, look what we did with your money. Okay? And this is an example of the acknowledgement statement for PRC-TRC that we are frequently reminded that we have to write everything, and now they included National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. And this is the award number we see here, right? Clearly stated in bold and in blue so you can highlight and see it. Okay. But it's always good to ask, as a courtesy, before you acknowledge someone, ask them, Sometimes people want to be anonymous, and it's really awkward that after you acknowledge them and you think it's a good intent, they say, "Oh, I don't want to be mentioned in that paper." Okay, so if you, it's rather you ask before, then you will have to make a correction or retraction of that comment or of that acknowledgement. It's kind of embarrassing after the fact, but just ask them before. And it could be something like an email. We're in the final stages of preparing this manuscript, and we have greatly appreciated your generous donation of whatever, and we would delighted, subject to your approval, to acknowledge to you this contribution to our research and in the acknowledgement section of the manuscript. So we will look forward to learning if this is acceptable for you. If the person says, yes, it's okay, then go ahead and acknowledge that person. If they don't, take them out. Okay, so this is just a brief review. Actually, it's pretty technical, and you can always refer somewhere to, make sure that you've done it right. But it's really easy to do. Introduction, with the literature citation, it's another technical aspect that you want to make sure you do it right. You're providing a list of publications that contain key information that really impacted the research that you're communicating in the manuscript. So those citations that are in the introduction, discussion, and results are really saying that they will help the readers evaluate the intellectual processes. Those citations in materials and method will actually be very important for the readers if they're interested in repeating the experiment. So use them wisely. But always be succinct. I mean, this is not like a thesis or dissertation or something like that you want to really impress the reviewers with a whole bunch of publications. This is what you're really going to pick and choose the best ones. If you're giving out too many references, it's actually unnecessary and counterproductive. It'll become annoying for the reviewers. They don't want to see you made it a simple statement, diabetes is a chronic disease, and then you have like 10 citations afterwards. No, that's too much, okay? So if you're a reader, you want to really access one or two that are directly applicable, not many of them. And then if you have too many, then it makes the reader, it looks like you don't really know which one is the most pertinent. So be succinct with that. And then obviously find the correct reference. Always use the most recent, the most pertinent, or the first reference that is pertinent. When you're doing materials and methods, cite just a single reference for each material, and actually if it's a specific methodology, it's usually the first time it was discussed in the literature that you want to look for. Even it was 1980 or something, because that one is where they really describe step by step how to do that methodology. If you look on for more recent papers, they usually refer back to the old one, and then you don't want to have a reader trying to look at that new one and then have to look up the other one that's further behind, and just annoys people. Annoys anybody, right? Okay, so then you find the original description for the material and method and then use that one. Okay, so on review articles, I know people, it's really easy and say, oh, I'm just going to use a review article and use all the things that are there. That's very tempting, but it should not be used as a substitute. Okay, when you're making a broad statement, maybe you could use it because you're just saying something in general that doesn't require a lot of detailed support, and it will probably be impossible to select the best one among thousands of them. And these are two examples, right? You can then use a review article as a citation. Breast cancer is most common among women in the United States, and is therefore a primary focus of research. That is so broad. How do you select the best one? So maybe a review article for a very well-renowned author would be the best way to go. And another example would be endotoxin is well established to induce a robust inflammatory response. Robust inflammatory response, then that's very general as well. But if you're stating like a specific concept, you really shouldn't go with a review article. That's where you have to find a primary research that's directed, has investigated the issue you're trying to convey as such. Overall levels of mortality attributable to bacteremia with Enterococcus species have recently been shown to be equivalent to those observed with human bacterial pathogens generally considered to be substantially more virulent. So this is a new concept. This is something very specific. It should have cited primary publications for this. Okay, accuracy. This is something that people tend to overlook. And when, I don't know if Maria had the experience that sometimes when you look at the articles we're asked to review, you look at all the citations and they're like all over the place. That's kind of, it's curious because if you're a scientist, you've been trained to be very accurate in your observations, and then you just, blow it all away when you're doing your citations. Don't do that. It's a sign of being not very meticulous or not very careful. Okay? This was a study where in JAMA by Evans et al., where they looked at 50 randomly selected citations from 3 journals, and they found over 33% had citation errors. So these were the incorrect journal name, wrong page, omission of year and volume, and it's kind of like, it was done somewhere in New England Journal, and then how is that person going to find that information if you don't have everything there? And usually if you're using a citation manager, it won't let it slip by. They also found that over 25% were quotation errors, and that's probably even worse because it's what the citation they cited, it didn't really substantiate what's said by the author. So it was unrelated or it was contradicted, and maybe they just used a phrase that a person used to convey, to initiate the message, but they really didn't thoroughly read the article at the very end where the conclusion is stating something totally different. So this just happened because the person did not take the time to really read that article, okay? So this is another thing that you have to do. As an investigator, you have to read everything you're going to cite and make sure you understand the message. If you don't really understand what the message is, then don't use it because you don't want to look like you don't really, you're just signing it for just to have a number up there, okay? And then always consult your instructions for authors to be able to make sure that you format these literature citations correctly. Using an incorrect style for the editors and reviewers is irritating, and you don't want to irritate the reviewers, because if they have a bad mood and you make it worse, then they're going to really do something with your paper that you won't like. Okay, citation manners, I won't go into detail because it's readily available online. It's just a way of simplifying the process of capturing information and a way to format it in the journal. You can establish your own personal database and download the articles you want to use in that paper, and then they have the multiple style options so you can just format it well. And this is I know Mariela loves Mendeley, and then EndNote or Sotera are sort of like examples. When you're looking at the basic styles for the literature citations, there are like really 3 basic ones. It's using alphabet number system where you cite everything in alphabetical order, and according to that order, you assign a number, and then that number goes back into the text and inserts it. That, to me, is kind of like harder because sometimes if you're developing a project or a manuscript, you have to make sure that you're going to have all your citations there so you can know where to put it in. But more frequently used is the Vancouver system, is where you start numbering them as soon as they appear in the references within what you're writing about. So this is easier because you sort of like number them along the way, and the names has no difference, no impact on the order. The other frequently used style is the Harvard system, where everything is placed in alphabetical order, but the citations are placed with the author's name and date of publication, just the first name and the date and the year. So this is used a lot more people who are in basic science or other types of professionals. Usually clinicians do not use this that much, And also, if you use this type, if you're doing a grant or something, it sort of like takes up a lot of space that you don't want to really, you lose that space with this. So the Vancouver system with numbers is probably easier and faster, and doesn't really occupy a lot of space. But then bear in mind that there's a lot of different variations that each journal has decided to use. So sometimes they want you to put the commas after the last name, others don't. They want the periods within the names, the first and middle names. Other times they want the first and middle name up front, others in the back. And then sometimes they want only the first page to be cited. Others want all of the pages to be cited. And then sometimes some of them want the year in parentheses, and others want it at the back. So you really have to look at that particular journal and say, how do you want it, and just follow the instructions there. Okay, so I'm going to leave you now with Maria with a very important subject on submission.
Hi, good afternoon. If you're already talking about submission, that means you're ready. The paper's ready, and you're ready to go. But before you sit down and submit, you can trick yourself that it's a really quick process, and that'll depend on your journal. Sometimes I'll sit down and you can submit a journal in an hour, 45 minutes. It'll depend on the journal. I've had problems, and I've been submitting a paper for a whole day. So just be ready to go through a process that may be tedious and may be time-consuming, but if you go through this submission checklist, you'll have all the information you need just to sit down and get this over with. So even before submitting the manuscript, you could do this check, but I think that once you have your manuscript assembled, you should be really, really sure that it's the best manuscript you could write. Once you sit down, you really need to go to your instructions to authors just to verify if you have the correct format, if your figures need to be changed to a specific resolution. That's happened to me before. And sometimes you need to use specific software. You need to Photoshop it or something to have it at 300 dpi. So you should have that in mind. You have to be really, really sure that your spelling and your grammar is correct. If not, I'll show you at what point they'll return the manuscript back to you. You also need all the contact information, affiliations, emails from all of your contributing authors, and sometimes even your the recommended reviewers. You'll need their affiliation, their contact information, and sometimes some journals will ask you for a justification of why you chose those reviewers, so you should be sort of ready to have that information available as well. And one of the most important things is to have your cover letter ready to submit. So I don't know in terms of the audience if everybody has submitted a paper. I just submitted a paper to this journal, so I'm going to walk you through their submission. This is an example of a relatively easier submission. Some other journals have other specifications. So this submission process in this journal has 7 steps. In the first step, you need to provide your abstract. You need to have a running title, which is a shortened title of your manuscript. How many characters or letters it can have will be instructed to you in the instructions to authors. You'll need your title, and that's pretty much it for that part. Next, you move to the attributes. When they say attributes here, they're just talking about keywords. In the other presentations we've had, we touched about the importance of choosing the correct keywords so other authors can look up your work. In this journal, you only need 3 keywords, and the maximum is 6, for example. But that all can change according to the journal you choose. So if this cartoon does not emphasize how I hate this part, it's my least favorite part. I mean, if you have 3 or 4 authors, fine. But usually in this part, you need to introduce each author individually and link them up to their corresponding affiliated institutions. And if they have more than one institution, it becomes this whole time-consuming process. but I only emphasize that you have all of the information with you or close to you so you can do this as quickly as possible. And step 4, they go through the reviewers. In this section, at least in this journal, you can say which reviewers you want. You do not have to justify why, which is awesome, because sometimes that could be sort of hard trying to write that up at the last second. And you could also indicate here who has a conflict of interest with you and you would not have as a reviewer for your manuscript. In the 5th step, it's called details and comments. And this is where you talk about your financial support. It actually searches through a database, and if it's not in the database, it could be a little bit tricky to put in your financial support here. You also talk about the conflicts of interest of all of the authors. Some other journals do not have that part with the competing interests. They'll actually have a separate form that each author has to sign, and you have to get in single PDF and submit. So even though I'm giving you this example, bear in mind that it can all vary according to the journal. Also, in this section, they ask for the cover letter, and they want you to provide all of the details of your manuscript, including how many pages, the word count, how many figures. So that's actually good information to have at hand as well. The step 6 is pretty easy. It just wants you to upload all of the different documents. According to the journals, some journals will allow you to upload your document with all your tables and figures in the same manuscript. Others will have you upload each individually. It'll all depend, but this would be the section to do it. And step 7 is just review and submit. You actually just hit a submit button and it's done. So I think that one of the most important things to actually have your manuscript sent out to peer review, which is the goal when you're submitting your manuscript, is to write a very convincing cover letter. So what is the goal of a cover letter? So a cover letter should be a short letter that actually gives all of the information the editor will need to actually manage your manuscript at an administrative level. It should justify why your article is good for that journal, and it also should sell yourself. You want to say how your research is actually advancing that field. At the end of the day, your cover letter will be one of the determining factors that will influence the decision of the editor either to continue the review process or reject your manuscript. So before you start, there's general guidelines that you actually follow in a cover letter, but each journal will have specific information that they want you to include in the cover letter. It'll go from some journals want the reviewers to be mentioned in the cover letter, to others they'll need some other specific information. Make sure that your cover letter has all the required elements. If not, it will be returned, or your paper will not be reviewed in that journal. You can also add additional information, and this is some of the information that can be usually added to a cover letter. You could have the authors. I generally don't add authors, but it's very important to have your title and the type of manuscript. Different journals have different type of manuscript, and you should find which type would be more suitable for your publication. Also, this is extremely important. You have to justify the relevance of the manuscript to the scope of the journal. Why should it be published there? You should include in every cover letter a statement that the manuscript isn't being considered in another journal. You could also include information regarding prior partial publication. Was your abstract published because you presented at an AACR meeting, for example? You should mention conflict of interest. For example, if the author receives honoraria from a company that is generating the drug you have in your trial, you should mention that. And it'll depend on the journal if you do it in a separate form or if you do it as part of the cover letter. You could talk about agreements to share publication materials, the reviewers, as I mentioned before, who's the corresponding author. If you need to include an NIH PubMed central deposit statement, you could include it here. And if you use copyrighted material, you use a figure that was published in Nature Reviews, and you actually get the authors and the journal's permission to include it in your manuscript, you can mention this here. So I wanted to actually give you sort of a little bit of flavor and a little bit of a more one-by-one, 101 how to write a cover letter. So what letter format do you use? You should use standard business format, which is what's shown in the bottom. You have the editor-in-chief's first or last name, because that's the person you should address it to. But sometimes you can't find the editor-in-chief's name anywhere on their database or on their web page. So you could use Dear Editor as an alternative. So when you write this letter, at the top right-hand part, you should have the editor-in-chief first and last name, their title in the bottom, and the journal name in italics. The journal name of it in italics should be used throughout the letter. Month and date. And then how do you address the editor-in-chief? The proper way would be Dear Dr. the last name. So in the first paragraph, after when you start to write your cover letter, you should include the name of the manuscript. You can include the names of the authors. I usually have not done that before because sometimes it's a lot of names and you don't really need that there. You have to include them one by one in their web page. So I really don't do that there, but you could. And also describe what type of a manuscript submission is it? Is it a research article? Is it a review? Is it a case study? This would be an example in the bottom of how you could write this. Dear so-and-so, we respectfully submit or are pleased to submit. That would be the alternative, not that you include that in parentheses. Our original research article entitled so-and-so for consideration for publication in Science, for example. So that would be an adequate way to introduce your manuscript to be considered. So the second and third paragraph, this is where you actually sell yourself and sell your research and sell your results. Why should you be published in this journal? You should describe the rationale or objective of your study as well as major findings. You can refer to prior work. If you have prior work that has served as a foundation to what you're proposing now or for your study now, you can actually even cite yourself and say that this work was established based on what you published elsewhere. Also, you want to briefly explain why is it a good fit for this journal. You don't want to say, hey, my findings are novel or they're an interest to the field. You actually want to go back to their website, want to look up their scope, and want to use keywords that they use there as to why your research is relevant to be published in their journal. For example, if you are seeking to publish in a journal where they're really interested in clinical applications, then you want to rationalize your findings as to how it will advance clinical applications. So I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you'll have access to this slides and some other examples I've included. But just to go over on this example, so in the first paragraph, they're making reference to something they published before. And then they're saying that they're expanding on this work in what they want to publish on this paper. In the second paragraph, they're talking about their important findings. You should not go exhaustively into your important findings. You want to do one or two key findings. What are the most impactful findings in your study? Also, talk about how the findings advance the field. That's your sell point. And then how the findings are relevant to the scope of the journal. And I actually found this very interesting. So if you want to go further than just say, hey, my work is relevant to the focus of the journal, you can say how your work actually complements other papers that are published in that journal. And that would be, I think, a very convincing way to go as well. The closing paragraph should have some key sentences. The first sentence would be that it has not been published or is being considered elsewhere. that all authors have approved the manuscript and agreed to submission to this journal. That should definitely be there in any cover letter. You can disclose your conflicts of interest. You can list potential reviewers if the journal actually asks that of you. You can also say who you do not want to review your manuscript and why, if that's an option. And then you finish with a sentence thanking them for their consideration. And you can close using kind regards, thank you sincerely, followed by your name, your institution, your affiliation, your address if you want to, and your contact information. So this is another example with exactly all of the things I previously mentioned in the previous slide. And you can all use them for when you're going to submit a paper as a template, actually. So in summary, the cover letter can be the difference between an initial rejection or the decision to move forward with the review process. You have to carefully draft this letter, as carefully as you drafted your manuscript, to be honest, and proofread it before you send it. The cover letter should not have any errors, because if the editor reads it and it has grammatical errors all over, it'll seem sloppy. And if he just reads this letter and that represents you, he'll think your manuscript as a whole will be sloppy. So he won't be as motivated to recommend review. And I think the italicized name of the journal I mentioned before, but that's a really important point to have present. So this is another example that I found on the web. All the references I used are at the bottom, and they give you really nice insight as to things you can write and how to make a very convincing cover letter for submission. So in terms of the review process, once you're ready to review, what happens once you hit that submit button? So once you go through that submit button, although it varies, I'll present sort of the general structure of the review process. But I want to stress the importance of peer review. When you're looking at journals, there's a lot of journals to choose from. And some of them do not implement the peer review process. The peer review process is actually what helps us, as scientists, publish good science, and that benefits the entire community. And it confirms the validity of the science reported. Without the review process, anybody could publish whatever they found, and nobody would have any say in that. And I think everybody that's published or submitted a paper before, it sometimes can be a painful process. Reviewers are not always polite and nice. Sometimes their comments make you angry. Actually, I didn't mention it, but in the book, they have like a whole page saying how you should not write back to the reviewers when you're angry. So at the end of the peer review, your paper should be more robust, easier to read, and more useful. If you look at the drawing to your right, sometimes it feels like this. You have like your perfect study that you submitted to them, and they end up adding all sorts of stuff that the reviewers actually think are making your study better. And it has, at the end of the day, they're actually giving us advice for free. They're experts helping us be better at our job, which is science. So even though it's a painful process, just think, reviewers may find places where things aren't as clear. So sometimes we're so immersed in our topic that we think, this is easier to read. That's fine. But other people that do not know about the subject can actually can actually not understand that. So reviewers can help you. Point out where more explanation or additional experiments are needed to make your study better. It can make it easier to read, and it can make it useful. Sometimes what you need to do is actually push it a little bit more in terms of how is your research important to the field, how it can be applied. And reviewers sometimes can give you insight into that. So this is a very simplified drawing of what happens in the peer review process. Scientists study something. Scientists write something up. They send their whole submission package to the reviewer. The reviewer decides, hey, this is worth worth sending out to peer review, it goes to the peer review. The peer reviewer sends it back. The editor sends it back to you. You fix whatever they're saying you need to fix. You send it back to the editor. It goes back to peer review. And if they deem it acceptable, it then gets published. So let's talk about what happens a little bit more in the detail. The scientist submits the paper. Almost all journals, this does not go directly to the editor. It actually goes to their editorial staff. And what they're going to do is they're going to go through your paper to see that you're meeting all of the formatting guidelines, that your word count is correct, that you're using the correct citation templates, that everything's correct. And if it is, it'll then go to the editor. If not, they'll send it back to you and they'll ask you to fix it. So at this stage, once the editorial staff reviews the format and deems it acceptable, they'll send it to the editor. What does the editor actually read? Most times it will be the cover letter and the abstract. And from that, he'll decide if it's relevant to the scope of the journal. Sometimes it won't be that clear, and you don't really want to do that. You want to be extremely clear in your cover letter and your abstract. But in some cases, when it's not clear, he'll actually go to the discussion. And he'll read the discussion and make a decision there. So these are common editorial reasons for rejection. It's out of the scope of the journal. Sometimes they'll even recommend other journals or sister journals that you could submit to that will actually accommodate your paper. It's not enough of an impact. Well, this actually applies to very high impact journals, and I think that everybody here knows when you have science-worthy research. If you send it to a very, very high impact research where the rejection rates are high, this could be some of the reasons. Another, when they're saying not enough impact for the journal, another reason could be that you don't necessarily aim for a high impact journal, but you're aiming for a very general journal, say +1. And if you have a very specific research niche, if you don't justify it well enough, why people in the general scientific community will be interested, they'll deem it that it's not worthy of +1, that you should rather go to a specialized journal. So these are things that you should think about, because sometimes this could be a time-consuming process. They'll get back to you 4 weeks, so you don't want to lose that time between. Also, another reason for rejection would be that it's not in the correct format, that it's not necessary all of the details that the reader needs to repeat the experiments, that the references are not up to date, poor language quality, poorly presented data, or it's difficult to follow, or there's been a violation of publication ethics. So let's go back to our little drawings to understand what's going on now. So once the editor deems that your paper is ready to go to peer review, how will the editor select the reviewers? There are 3 ways. He can either just consider the recommended reviewers, or based on the abstract and what we read, he'll have some reviewers in mind. And this could happen a lot in specialized journals, where they have a particular expertise and he would have reviewers on the top of his head. Also, many journals have reviewer databases that the editor can select reviewers from those databases. At the end of the day, the reviewer should have sufficient expertise to critically read your manuscript and should have no conflict of interest so that he could actually help your science move forward. So once the editor selects the reviewers, he'll send your paper to the reviewers. And there's 3 types of reviews. It could be a closed review, an open review, and a double-blind review. Most reviews are closed, and that means the reviewers knows who you are, but you don't know who your reviewers are. There's other journals now that they're completely open. You know who the reviewers are, the reviewer knows who you are, and actually they even publish the critiques along with your paper. And also there's the double-blind review where nobody knows who each other is. review and base of the science. So in terms of peer review, it's a structured process. Reviewers are given guidelines to review the manuscript where they consider significance, originality, approach, the discussion, appropriate statistical analysis, conclusions, and even citations. The reviewer then can provide three recommendations, would be rejection, acceptance, and modification. Like most of you must know, upright acceptance is extremely rare. Usually, papers come back with major modifications or minor modifications. When we talk about major modifications, they'll ask for additional experiments, analysis. They want you to rewrite sections. They want to alter tables. And once you do this, you respond to the reviewers, and you send them your paper back with all the changes they recommended. If you have minor modifications, it's just little tweaks here and there. They'll make your paper clear. And usually, when you respond to these recommendations, the editor will go over them and he'll decide to publish right there and then. It won't have to go to a second round of peer review. So, common technical reasons for outright rejection. Usually they require more experiments or more analysis. They consider you have incomplete data, you have small sample size or poor controls. Poor analysis, meaning you don't have the correct statistical tests to actually reach a conclusion. Inappropriate methodology, your hypothesis is not clear or valid. Your conclusions are not supported by the data. These are things you should definitely avoid at all costs. So what happens when the peer reviewers go through your paper? How do they communicate it back to you? Usually you'll receive a letter from the editor informing of their decision. The editor will give you an overview of the changes that they suggest to be made, but then you'll get a link, or you'll get actually your reviewer's comments right then and there. It'll be very specific. It'll say, reviewer 1, comments number 1, number 2. Point by point, it'll go through your paper with the things that they recommend to make your paper better. This letter is also very important because it'll give you the information you need in terms of how they want the changes to be highlighted or shown in the edited paper. Sometimes they'll tell you to highlight it yellow, to use track changes, but it'll be specific to the journal itself. Also, it'll give you a deadline. Usually the deadlines are like 2 months. If you go over 2 months, and you actually submit the paper with all the edits, it'll be considered a new submission, and it'll start from scratch again. So you want to have your deadline in mind. If you can't make that deadline, tell your editor before time and ask for an extension. Usually they'll accommodate you. So, the response to reviewers. So this is where the anger and, whoa, this reviewer's an idiot comments come to your head. Or didn't he read this? It's clearly on the second table. I mean, sometimes it is, but you have to have in mind, they're taking their time, they're doing this for free, and at the end of the day, they're trying to make your science better. So writing the response to reviewers is sort of an art. It'll feel like you're curtsying to them a lot. You have to thank them a lot and be very polite. And you want to thank the reviewers and the editors for their time and their comments. You want to address all of the points, point by point, that the reviewers and editors made. You have to be polite and respectful with your rebuttals. This is not like a grant. When I've been taught that when you have a review from a grant, the reviewer is always right. You will do what the reviewer says. Here, you have a little bit more leeway. You can actually tell them you're not doing that change because you believe X and X, because you have maybe some citations that support that your method is better than what they're suggesting. You can do that, but in a very polite and respectful way. Remember that when they go to the second round of review, the reviewers would read this letter. So you don't want to anger the reviewers. You want to have them on your side. Also, you want to write it in a way that you have all of the reviewers' comments present. I'll show you an example. And you could respond to each of them in a way that's easier for them to understand. And as I said before, they'll tell you how to highlight this in the text. One of the things I do is that I put line numbers on the side of the page, and sometimes I'll refer to paragraph 2, line X. So not only do I highlight it, I actually tell them exactly where it is in the page just in case they missed it. So this is an example of a response agreeing with the statement of the reviewer and disagreeing. With the agreement part, let's skip that because that is easy. We agree, we did the changes, move on. But if you go to the disagreeing statement, read it. It's super, super polite. You're respectfully disagreeing and proposing why what you did is easier. See another way to highlight where it is, page 3, paragraph 2. There's lots of ways to do it. You'll find that you can choose which way is the best way for you to convey what you did and where you made that change. So this is actually an excerpt of a letter that I wrote. I couldn't find any templates in the internet. So you want to address the editor. In this case, I addressed the lead guest editor because it was a special issue. I make reference to the article number. That's really important to include also in your response to the reviewers. And in that first paragraph, you're really thanking them to their insightful suggestions. So it's sort of a flowery way of saying thank you for your time, really, really appreciate it, even though you want to pull their hair out sometimes. And in this case, I highlighted track changes so everybody could see the changes. One way that I think it's a very easy way to convey who said what is actually go reviewer by reviewer. I copy paste from their suggestions whatever they said, the whole thing. I put it in some sort of different font, and then my response is below. And I've found that has been effective in a lot of instances where I had to respond to reviewers. Don't think that this letter was 1 page. This was like 4 pages long. I just copy pasted so you could see the end of the letter. So we appreciate the opportunity to resubmit the manuscript for review. Thank you again. So it's very important to have this in mind. Very nice. Thank them lots of times for their insightful comments, their constructive criticism. All of this should be included in your letter. If you need any other assistance with this or you need any more examples, feel free to email me and I can email you some examples so you could use as a guide. So what happens after? So once you respond to reviewers, you send the edited manuscript, the editor reads it, assesses if you actually address the points that they want you to address. And once he decides that you did, if it were minor modifications, he outright accepts it. If it's major modifications, it goes to a second round of review. The reviewers go over the responses, and if they deem it agreeable, they'll suggest that the paper is published. But at the end of the day, the people with the power is the editor. The reviewers can say that they don't want to publish the paper, but if the editor feels like it's worthy, the paper will be published. And once you're accepted, what almost all of the journals do, they'll give you a PDF proof, and they'll give you usually 2 days to review it completely. This proof is your last opportunity to fix any of the errors that you may find. Sometimes the errors could be something you missed, or when they convert it to the PDF form, things will change. And you need to highlight that and tell the editor. And usually you'll have just one chance. I've had journals that every time they fix the error you find, they send it back. But sometimes you just have one chance, and it's very important that you go through this paper, maybe find somebody else to go through the proofs with you, and you have that done in the period that they give you, say the 2 days that they gave you. So I'll leave you with Dr. Hallman.
Okay, so it's a long, tedious process, but it's very necessary, huh? Okay, so now I have felt that I will talk a little bit about copyright issues because, you know, sometimes it becomes an issue with different types of journals. In general, any written document that is really protected. So an author of that document will be afforded specific rights to reproduce it, to use it, distribute it, and display the work. But this is really of relatively limited value because unless you submit it to the U.S. Copyright Office, you can't really claim a lawsuit to get financial recompensation for that. So, but the good thing is that if you find that someone infringed upon your copyright rights, you could probably retroactively just submit it to the U.S. Copyright Office and then file a lawsuit. So, you know, it's a lot of tedious work, but it can be done. And on the other hand, most of the biomedical journals will require that you transfer that copyright, because it's yours as an author, that you transfer it to the journal upon submission. So then when it's published, you may be the author, the one who created everything, and might be a Nobel Prize finding, but then it's no longer yours. So bear in mind, you can't reproduce it. You can't even use your own data. You can't distribute it, or you can't display it. Okay, so this implications is very important that you know, because it may be limited. Sometimes, you know, in University of Puerto Rico, everything that's published, they post it to an institutional repository, and then even that would be limited if you don't hold the copyright. If you want to use it for your personal website as well, you want to copy it for personal or professional use, it's really ridiculous, but you won't be able to do it. So you have to check that journal special policies. It's usually on the website. If it's not there, then ask the journal and state it in advance. I am submitting this, but I need it as a repository to my institution. I need to do such and such with this work, and so they know. If you're going to include something that was published prior, remember that you have to ask permission for it in writing, and you have to get that permission in writing before you submit it. So even if it's your own data, you created a fabulous table that you want to use for a class, even that you have to ask, you know, if it's going to be published somewhere else. Because sometimes a class can be you know, recorded like this, and then they figure it out and say, you didn't ask permission for that table. You said, well, I created it. Okay. But, you know, it has to be asked beforehand. And then sometimes it may take some time to get that permission back to you. Some websites of a journal will be able to have an area that you can request it, and it might be faster, but some journals take some time to really respond to you back. Okay, some exceptions is for Biomed Central, they don't really require that the author transfers the copyright to them, so then it's all yours for free of charge and you can use it. But they want to know that the figure of the table you are requesting or wanting to use is original, it's yours, you created it, and that you identify the original publisher, and then you state that in your acknowledgement. Okay. Okay, but then you also have to comply to any funding agency. If they gave you the money, you have to it's mandated that you have to send it out to PubMed Central. And this is within a 12-month period of its being published. So some journals you have to figure out, is that journal going to do it for me? or if that journal will make me do it. Because if you're responsible, you have to do it. If it doesn't really say, then you should write somewhere in the cover letter to the editor, and we're going to sign the copyright that you need to do it. And I put an example right here. The New England Journal acknowledges that the author, you, retains the right to provide a copy of the final manuscript to NIH upon acceptance for this publication and for public archiving in PubMed Central as soon as possible. So you write it ahead. Listen, I really have to submit this here when I'm giving you the copyright. Okay? Now let's talk about corrections and retractions. This is what you really don't want to do. If you read everything, as Maria said, and you look through everything, your proofs and everything carefully, you should not be able to have any problems. But sometimes they do occur. Dealing with these problems, you just do it. If there are errors, properly and honestly, you have to determine how bad is it. If it was, for example, a decimal point, then the person who wants to reproduce it won't be able, because 10 is not the same as 100, right, when you're measuring out something. But then always communicate with the editor. Listen, I found this problem, this error after publication. How do I address it? It may be something simple that can be done with an addendum or an erratum. Nowadays, you find a lot of them, right? Usually they're like in a little part of the journal, just a little far away, and then nobody really looks at it, but it's published. At least it was done. And the worst scenario is when you had this fabulous postdoc fellow in their lab and did a whole bunch of experiments, and then he was taken off and whisked to somewhere else, and then nobody can replicate what's been doing there. So this is like something really bad. You have to notify the editor and say, I don't know how he did it, and you ask that that person who left the lab and say, how did you do it? What did you they should have left a detailed like notebook of everything that was done. But then if you can't reproduce it, then the validity of that data is really in question. So most journals the editor would decide, well, we're going to retract the article. If you further investigation, it was an honest error, they'll probably write a little erratum where you cannot really find that, saying, oh, we retracted it, but actually it was an honest mistake. So, disregard the retraction. But it's an embarrassment anyway. So when you're dealing with potential post-publications irregularities, one investigator recommended to sort of like categorize and in specific terminology. A correction is something just a little minor detail. An expression of concern is when the editor's thinking that it probably fake data or plagiarized data or something's really wrong, but the investigation hasn't concluded. And the retraction, it really denotes that the investigator contained faked or plagiarized data. So sometimes it's the level of the error, okay? And we're talking about manuscript retractions. Years ago, decades ago, wasn't really common. But then more and more, just by 2008, there are about 200 per year. So people are really, really looking at that data that's being published. One article, when they looked at all the Medline retractions from a period of 3 years, and they went back a third of them for more, they found that most were issues by the author. The author in itself was the one requesting the retraction, or by editors. And most common reasons were like honest errors or non-reproducible findings, research misconduct, and less redundant publications. Another article looked at journals between 2001 and 2010, and they even devised a retraction index score. They looked at which gave a score, and they found it was very highly significant, the retraction index, according to the journal's impact factor. One would think that manuscripts are retracted from these little shady little journals that have, they usually get manuscripts that are not that worthy, or not so important. Actually, it's to the contrary. The journals that with the high impact are the ones that are retracting more. And they look at the possible reasons. Maybe it was because they were so urgent to publish in this high impact journal, they didn't look at the data, or they repeat the data to make sure it's okay. Maybe it's the brutal competition, like, I really need that journal, New England Journal of Medicine. You know, everybody's like, oh, you think your world is over because you got something in New England Journal of Medicine. But they might don't fall into the trap of falsifying your data to do that. And sometimes because these journals are looked at a lot. And you know, when you discuss journals, how these everybody's like, oh, they criticize every little thing. So apparently they're found more often. But the high impact journals are the worst to go, the worst in retraction. And then these retractions are usually linked to fraud. I know there's been so many that have been retracted, and I know, you probably recall this one, that it made headlines. First of all, there was this doctor in Britain that stated that all these vaccines were linking to autism, and then that made a whole bunch of news, right? And then even today, people think that autism is caused by vaccinations, right? It's in the mind of many people, and even more so in doctors who should be more scientific. But then when they looked at it, back to it, it actually wasn't a very elaborate fraud. So this was published all over the place. This doctor was stripped of his license. He's no longer a medical doctor. It was published all over the place. Then, that they had to retract it because of fraud. And this was in 2011, so it's fairly recent. You don't want something like that to happen with you, so you try to avoid it. And one way of avoidance is these investigators who have a lot of people working in their lab. This is more in basic science than clinical science, but then they have a lot of people working. They have, different levels, and some those in master's, others in doctorate level, and some in postdoc. Really make sure that you have regular meetings with them, and then help them along the way and look at the preliminary studies and make sure that you can identify early on any technical errors, okay? So then remember that each author has to contribute significantly to the paper, so make them really, really work and look at the preparation of the manuscript and review it prior to submission. So they have, if their name is on the top, then they better do the work, okay? So they can look at it, because you really want to capture this really, really earlier than have to deal with retractions and corrections, okay? So some final comments. We're running a little fast today, but it's okay. This is sort of like more boring anyway. I thought I wanted to talk a little bit, but Maria also mentioned it, how, most authors believe that the reviewers are just like these people who are nitpickers, have no originality, or jealous, and they just want to delay my publication. They just want to plagiarize or copy whatever I wrote, and they have these all negative things about them. But they fail to recognize that these reviewers are actually people who are doing it for free, okay? Hardly any of the reviewers are getting paid for their time. They're doing it for free. They have a high commitment of trying to get the best science published. So they're doing it because they just love science. They have the time, they have the dedication, and they're in science. And they may have a bad day and probably really do write some harmful comments. But, think of them as human beings. They actually perceive themselves to be unthanked, ignored, and reviled. They give their free time, their energy. They're trying to reanalyze, redirect, and rewrite. And sometimes they know the author, and they really want to help the author to get the best paper out there. So there's, I'm doing all this, and that person even doesn't know who I am. So think about that. It's a different way of thinking about things, and try to look at what they're trying to comment in a positive way. The other thing is capitalize on the quest to publish. If you really want to help the editor who's struggling, who's really busy, just as Maria stated, suggest a reviewer. You know, get some qualified. You know your field. You should know your field actually better than the editor. So suggest those qualified investigators to review it. Make sure they don't have any conflict of interest. And then 3 independent studies that are cited below revealed that author-recommended reviewers actually increase the acceptance rate more than editor-appointed, okay? So you want to make sure that you get this friendly reviewer who's very well qualified in their field on, to help you out with that. And then if you know of someone who's obviously biased against your work or competing with your work or hates your name or hates your guts or something, just, write it out. I need to exclude this person. Be very kind where you're given the reasons. So make sure you express, and not because I don't like that person, is use another way of stating why you do not recommend that reviewer. And then actually what you're doing is helping the editor's time. So you're sort of like getting on his favor, okay? And then the final comment is, if it was rejected, after you try to, everything you tried to resubmit, if they asked for more changes and you did it. I know of one paper where at the beginning when you started that it was rejected 2 times, and the people asked for our reviews, and we helped out. It was basically a thing of writing. It was the writing method was really not as favorable. So it was submitted a 3rd time. It was actually accepted the 3rd time. But if you've tried and tried, just move on. Okay, maybe you can find an alternative journal. Maybe it's, and do that. But never use don't really vent your anger against the editor or the reviewers, because they really have long memories. And some of them know you, but you know them, and they're still like, I'm going to get you after a while. So they have elephant memory, and you don't want them to use that against you. Okay? So here we are. Anything, any questions so far? This is sort of like more technical and boring, but we want it equally important for all of you guys to know as our 3rd section. So we're concluding our 3-part series finally. Maria and I have been very busy and doing this on top of. We hope all of you enjoyed all the information we've given to you, and hopefully you get your papers out there and published. Okay, so any questions so far? You're all awake, still awake? Okay, well, thank you so much for your time, and hope it's been helpful.